Stand at 660 South Locka Street in Post Falls, Idaho, on a cold morning in early spring, and the building does not look like history. It looks like a factory. 128,000 square feet of pre-engineered steel and concrete, sitting on 12 acres of northern Idaho industrial land, surrounded by pine ridgelines, and the kind of flat gray sky that presses down on the panhandle for months at a time. There are no monuments outside, no plaques, no sculptures of folding knives bolted to the lawn, but walk through the front doors and the smell hits you first: cutting oil, warm steel, the dry mineral bite of grinding dust carried on refrigerated air. Then the sound: belt grinders cycling in steady rotation, the low mechanical rhythm of ceramic tumblers rolling batches of finished blades. And somewhere deeper in the building, behind a heavy steel door, the hiss of a cryogenic freeze chamber, dropping a rack of blade blanks to 110 degrees below zero. 320 people work inside these walls. They've been making knives here for 20 years. And somewhere inside this building, the 15 millionth Model 110 folding hunter has already been stamped, ground, assembled, and shipped. But there was a morning in January of 2003 when the man whose family name is pressed into every single one of those blades sat down at a desk in El Cajon, California, and faced the kind of decision that does not appear in business school case studies. He was not deciding whether to close the company. He was deciding where it would live, and whether it would still be American when it got there. This is the story of how Buck Knives left California to save itself, while the rest of the American cutlery industry simply disappeared. If stories about companies that chose their workers over their margins, that chose Idaho over China, belong on the historical record, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Subscribe before we go further. Hoyt Buck, Leavenworth, Kansas, 1902. To understand what Buck Knives became, you have to start with a 13-year-old boy standing at a forge in Kansas in the first year of the 20th century. His name was Hoyt Heath Buck, and he was not a hobbyist. He was not a curious boy with a weekend project. He was a blacksmith's apprentice, which in 1902 meant he was handed rough steel, a fire, and a set of tongs, and told to make something that would hold. The problem Hoyt kept running into was the same one every farmer in the region knew personally: grub hoe blades and reaping tools dulled too fast. The steel was inconsistent. Some sections held a working edge through a full day in the field. Others crumbled within hours. The difference between a blade that lasted and one that failed was invisible to the eye. It lived somewhere inside the metal itself. Hoyt began experimenting with the way steel was heated before quenching, applying heat uniformly, holding the temperature longer, watching the color shift from red to orange to a particular shade of pale straw that told him, not from a textbook, but from his own two eyes, that the steel was ready. He tested results with his thumbnail. He tested them on rope. He reworked failures and filed the lessons into memory. He was not a scientist. He was a boy teaching himself metallurgy from a fire. And by the time he was 15 years old, Hoyt Buck had developed a tempering process that produced edges his peers could not explain and his customers could not stop buying. That lived in his hands for the next 4 decades. He spent those years as a logger, a sawmill millwright, eventually an ordained Assembly of God pastor in Mountain Home, Idaho. He built furniture. He sharpened tools for ranchers who could not afford replacements. He lived quietly in the high desert of the Intermountain West, carrying a craft the world had not yet asked him to scale. It is worth stopping here, before the fame, before the factory, before the 15 million knives, to notice what Hoyt's story contains: a secret born in poverty, developed in isolation, carried in a single set of hands for 40 years. What he had discovered was not magic, it was method. And method, in American manufacturing, has a way of becoming either portable or forgotten, depending entirely on who holds it and what they decide to do with it. The world began pulling in December of 1941. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and within weeks, the federal government issued a call to American citizens: donate fixed-blade hunting knives to servicemen shipping overseas. Hoyt Buck did not have any knives to donate, but he had a forge and he had a church. He set up a small shop in the basement of the Mountain Home Assembly of God, began making knives from worn-out mill files he purchased for almost nothing, and started selling them to soldiers stationed at the nearby Mountain Home Army Air Base. He later said, "I didn't have any knives, but I sure knew how to make them." That sentence contains the whole company. In 1945, his health failed. He moved south to San Diego to be near his son, Alfred Charles Buck, a former Navy man who had fallen in love with the California coast and settled into the flat neighborhoods east of the city. 2 years later, Al nailed a 10 by 12-foot lean-to onto the side of his garage on Moreno Boulevard, and Buck and Son was open for business. Raw material: worn-out files salvaged from the dumpsters of the Consolidated Vultee aircraft plant nearby. Purchased at a penny apiece. Hoyt worked the forge, Al worked the floor. They sold to local butchers, to hunters, to anyone who needed an edge that would hold. Hoyt died in 1949. Still at the grinder, Al carried on alone. The late 1950s nearly ended everything. Al would say later that he came within a gnat's eyebrow of quitting. That for a stretch, the family made more money sharpening neighborhood lawnmower blades than making knives. An advertising man refused to run more ads until the bill was settled. Al's mother logged a personal loan in the ledger under her own name. A local pastor connected him to a manufacturing executive at Ryan Aeronautical, who helped attract outside investors. On April 7, 1961, Buck Knives was formally chartered. The lean-to was gone. A real factory was coming. And it is worth pausing on how close it came to never happening. Because the company that would eventually put its name on 15 million folding knives nearly folded in the garage where it started. The near death of the 1950s was not bad luck. It was the first warning that building a company on a single man's craft in a single city with no institutional protection was a bet that required everything to go right. Everything did not always go right. The knife that saved everything began with a board resolution. On April 18, 1963, the Buck Knives Board of Directors voted to authorize development of a new folding hunting knife, one strong enough to replace a fixed-blade sheath knife in the field. The engineering problem was specific. How do you build a folding blade that locks open rigidly enough to take real cutting pressure without snapping shut on the hand holding it? The man who solved it was named Guy Hauser, described by company historian Tom Abels as an eccentric who could accomplish more with baling wire and second-hand scrap iron than most engineers could with a fully equipped machine shop. What Hauser designed was a rocker bar lockback, a spring-loaded mechanism that held the blade rigidly open until the user depressed a lever at the spine of the handle. It was mechanically simple, it was structurally sound, and Buck made a decision, one of the most consequential decisions in American manufacturing history, not to patent it. The reasons are debated. The cost of filing, the urgency of getting to market, the belief, perhaps, that the design was too simple to protect. Whatever the logic, the result was this. The Buck 110 Folding Hunter became the single most copied folding knife design ever produced, and because anyone could copy it, the term buck knife passed out into the American language as the generic name for any folding lockback, regardless of who made it, regardless of where it was built. That is the rare fate of a thing so right it becomes invisible. You stop seeing it as a product. You see it as a given. The first 255 Model 110s shipped in the fourth quarter of 1964. By 1968, Buck's sales had grown 950% in 5 years. The knife was everywhere: hardware stores, sporting goods counters, Army-Navy surplus shops, hunting catalogs, the back pockets of farmers, electricians, and forest rangers who had never thought about knives before, but could not imagine working without one now. The 110s cost more than comparable fixed-blade alternatives, $12 to $20 against $5, and it sold anyway, because Buck paired that price with something no other American knife maker had offered: an unconditional lifetime guarantee. We warranty each and every Buck knife to be free of defects in material and workmanship for the life of the knife. Not 1 year, not 5 years, the life of the knife, the forever warranty. The most expensive promise in American manufacturing. In 1964, it was a competitive advantage. The American knife market was largely domestic. The gap between what an American factory spent to make a blade, and what an overseas competitor would one day spend to make the same blade was still theoretical, a problem that existed on economic charts, not on factory floors. What Chuck Buck, who joined his father Al in the 1950s and took over as president in 1979, could not have known was that by the 1990s, the forever warranty would become a chain, a promise Buck could not break, and that its competitors selling Chinese-made knives at a quarter of Buck's production cost had never made in the first place. In 1982, Buck signed a distribution deal with Kmart. In 1987, the United States Army awarded Buck the contract to manufacture the M9 bayonet, 315,600 units for American soldiers. By 1980, Buck had broken ground on a facility designed to match its own legend. The new plant at 1900 Weld Boulevard in El Cajon was 200,000 square feet under one roof on 10 acres of East County land, built to look like a European hunting lodge. Stone facade, heavy timber details. Because Chuck Buck believed the building itself should say something about the company inside it. At peak production, 600 people worked inside that building across 3 shifts. They operated a machine shop, a heat treatment facility, a grinding room, a handle assembly floor, as a ceramic tumbling operation, and a quality control line that hand-tested every blade before it left the property. Paul Boss, a heat treatment specialist, who would eventually have his name stamped on Buck's premium blades as a personal guarantee of quality, was refining the 3-stage proprietary process that began with high heat austenitizing, dropped the steel into a cryogenic freeze at negative 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and finished with a precise temper cycle. The result was edge performance that competitors buying identical steel grades could not consistently reproduce. The knowledge was still in the hands. It had simply been systematized. The company that began in a 10 by 12 lean-to was now arming the military and supplying Kmart, and the man whose grandfather had made knives from dumpster files was running a manufacturing operation that employed half the adult population of some small American towns. But the Kmart deal, celebrated at the time as a breakthrough, had opened a door that only went one direction. Entering mass retail meant Buck now competed on shelves controlled by buyers whose sole job was to push prices lower every season. The same retailers who gave Buck national reach would spend the next 2 decades demanding that it compete with products it could not match on cost without becoming something it fundamentally was not. The chain was already attached. It just had not gone taut yet. By the mid-1990s, it went taut. The Chinese knife industry had spent the previous decade building manufacturing capacity that produced folding knives at roughly 25% of what it cost Buck to make the same knife in California. Major American retailers, the same ones stocking Buck on their shelves, were leaning on every domestic knife company to either cut prices or lose the shelf space. Between 1995 and 2003, Buck's annual sales fell 25%. The workforce dropped from 600 workers to 250. In the year 2000, under pressure from those same retailers, Buck opened a contract manufacturing facility in China. It was not an expansion, it was a tourniquet applied to a wound that was still bleeding. And then California made its position unmistakably clear. In January 2001, Governor Gray Davis declared a state of emergency as rolling blackouts moved through the California power grid. For most businesses, an unplanned blackout meant lost productivity and damaged inventory. For Buck knives, it meant something far more specific. The 3-stage heat treatment process, the thing that separated a Buck blade from every Chinese-made imitation, required consistent, uninterrupted electrical power. You could not pause a cryogenic freeze cycle. You could not restart an austenitizing oven after an unscheduled outage and trust that the steel had been treated uniformly throughout. The energy crisis did not shut down the El Cajon plant, but it made visible, in a way that no quarterly report ever had, exactly how dependent Buck's most critical competitive advantage was on a power grid it did not control, and a state government that was not solving the problem. The second pressure was workers' compensation insurance. California's rates ran approximately 3 times what Idaho charged for the same coverage. The third arrived in November 2002, with statewide election results that C.J. Buck, fourth generation, president since 1999, later said publicly had removed his last reason to believe the California business climate would change direction. Three forces, arriving simultaneously from three different directions. The family looked at the results. They reached a conclusion. The state was not turning around, and Buck could not survive on the current course. One decision changed everything. It happened on January 15, 2003. C.J. Buck, Charles Joseph Buck, fourth generation, the man who had started on the production line building Model 110 of folding hunters in 1978, before working his way up to the office where he now sat, had been watching the numbers deteriorate for 8 years. He understood, with the precision that only someone raised inside a manufacturing operation can understand, what each line on the spreadsheet actually meant in human terms. Not headcount reductions, not workforce restructuring, people, families, the men and women who showed up every morning and made the knives that carried his grandfather's name. Chuck Buck, 66 years old, chairman of the board, the man who had built Weld Boulevard, who had signed the Kmart deal, who had won the bayonet contract, who had spent more than 4 decades building the company his grandfather started in a church basement, authorized the announcement Buck Knives was leaving California. CJ called his El Cajon employees together and told them the truth as plainly as he could manage. No more than a quarter of the workforce, approximately 60 people, would be offered rake relocation packages to Post Falls, Idaho. The rest, roughly 190 men and women who had been building Buck Knives in San Diego's East County, some of them for years, some for decades, would not be making the move. The jobs they had held were staying in the building. They were not. CJ later said that he wrestled with how much advance notice to give. We ran the risk of giving too much notice and possibly losing people while we still needed them. That's a chance we decided to take. It was a careful calculation made by a man trying to save the company. 190 people is not a calculation. 190 people is a neighborhood. The move happened in 2 waves. More than 50 tractor trailers loaded with CNC machines, ceramic tumblers, belt grinders, and Paul Boss's entire heat treatment operation, disassembled piece by piece, palletized, driven 1,400 miles north on Interstate 15, through the Mojave Desert and up through the Pacific Northwest into the Idaho Panhandle, then reassembled, machine by machine, in a 128,000 square foot building on 12 acres of Post Falls industrial land. The ribbon cutting at 660 South Locka Street was held on May 21, 2005. The Idaho Commerce Department had offered $3,000 per employee in training subsidies. The land cost approximately $800,000. The annual savings from the move exceeded $1.2 million, the largest single portion coming from workers' compensation insurance alone. The math was sound. The decision saved the company. And 6 years later, in August of 2009, C.J. Buck stood in front of approximately 200 Post Falls employees. People who had uprooted their lives, who had left California to follow the factory north, and told them he was cutting everyone's pay by 10%, including his own. It was the only way to position the company if the economy did not improve. The men and women who had made the move, who had taken the bet on Idaho, took the cut. Nobody walked out. The factory stayed open. While Buck was loading its tractor trailers, another American knife company was watching the same pressures accumulate and making a different calculation entirely. Imperial Schrod Corporation had roots reaching back into the 19th century, a roll-up of several storied American cutlery brands, including the Old Timer Knife Company and the original Schrod Cutlery Works, all eventually headquartered in Ellenville, New York, a small town of 4,130 people at the foot of the Catskill Mountains. Old Timer pocket knives, Uncle Henry hunting knives, the Schrade name itself, brands that sat on the same shelves as Buck in every sporting goods store in America, carried by the same hunters, given by the same co-fathers and grandfathers to the same sons. In early 2001, Schrade employed approximately 700 workers in Ellenville. By the end of 2003, layoffs had reduced that number to 382. In December of that year, 120 workers were let go without advance notice, just before Christmas. Some were called back in the spring. Most were not. On July 29, 2004, Trade President Walter Gardner sent his remaining workers a letter, one page. The last day of employment would be July 30th. 250 people. 1 day's notice. Ellenville had just lost the company that had employed its families for generations. In the time it takes to a single page out loud, Schrod filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy that September. The brand names, Old-Timer Uncle Henry, Schrade, were sold at auction for $8.6 million to Taylor Brands of Tennessee. Taylor Brands sold them to Smith & Wesson in 2016. Smith & Wesson moved production to China. The knives are still on the shelves today at prices the Ellenville factory could never have matched, carrying names that once meant something specific and now mean nothing, except that someone owns the trademark. Buck did not lose its factory to an investment group that bought the name and abandoned the building. It did not lose its workers to a corporate board that calculated the trademark was worth more without the people attached to it. It lost California and chose to move the entire operation 1,400 miles north rather than surrender either the name or the hands that gave it meaning. In 2024, C.J. Buck made a decision that may matter as much as the Idaho move. He hired the first non-family president in the company's 100-year history, Lane Tobias, a veteran of Smith & Wesson's firearms division and former head of lacrosse footwear. CJ's public explanation was one of the most honest things any fourth-generation owner has said about succession in public. One of the things I had wished was that my father had put someone between he and I. When he was ready to retire, I wasn't ready. He was not going to repeat that mistake. His son Josh is in the building, learning the work from a man who knows how to run a manufacturing company without the weight of the family name pressing down on every decision. In January of 2025, at SHOT Show in Las Vegas, Buck unveiled the Range 3 series, the company's first crossbar lock folder, going directly into competition with Benchmade and Spyderco for the modern everyday carry market. A company that built its entire identity on the Model 110 was now engineering for a customer who carries a knife to the office as readily as to the field. In May of 2025, Buck held a private gathering at the Post Falls plant and marked 20 years in Idaho. CJ brought together every worker who had made the original move from El Cajon, the ones who had loaded their lives onto moving trucks and followed a factory north on faith, and gave each one a commemorative knife, made in the building they had helped save, stamped with the name they had carried north. Stand again at 660 South Locka Street. Close your eyes. Hear the belt grinders, steady and low, cycling in the same rotation they have held for 2 decades. Smell the cutting oil and the cold air rolling out from behind the cryogenic chamber door. Feel, if you can, the weight of a finished blade, fresh from the grinding wheel, warm from the friction, solid in a way that asks to be used, with a name pressed into the steel that belongs to a specific family, in a specific building, on a specific street, in a town that the company had to choose to exist in. Now open your eyes. The building is still there. 320 people work inside it. The knives are still made in the United States of America. They did not save the factory by selling it. They did not save the name by shipping it overseas and hoping no one would notice. They loaded 50 tractor trailers, drove 1,400 miles north, and built the whole thing again from scratch in the Idaho Panhandle, in an industry that learned how to put American names on Chinese blades. Buck learned something different. They learned that the name on the knife is only worth what the hands behind it are worth. So they kept the hands.